In this video, we'll be going over 10 dungeons and raid fights that either didn't require a conventional tank speced class, or could just substitute a tank for like a DPS class instead. Starting off at number 10, we have the Grand Champions fight from the Trial of Champions dungeon. First off, we'll have a few on this list that are vehicle fights, as they technically allow anyone to play the role of a tank, but we will go through them first as it feels a little bit cheaty, as you're not playing your class but are tanking a vehicle which can tank. Anyways, for this fight it has two phases, the second phase being a generic fight, so we don't care about that. What we do care about is the first phase. That fight requires you and the rest of your party to joust on poles and hop on a mount, then to engage in battle of building armor, breaking armor, and weakening the enemies until they fall off. This is a real cool theme of a fight, which in reality acted more like a PvP match, as everyone was forced to play the role of a tank and a DPS, not really any healers for the fight though. Moving on, at number 9, we have Instructor Razuvious. This boss dealt far too much damage to be tanked normally, nearly one-shotting most tanks with every unbalancing strike, even for fully geared Naxxramas tanks. The boss also had a massive damage AoE stun that also drained mana. These two things combined makes the fight theoretically impossible. However, alongside the Instructor, there are 4 Death Knight understudies. These adds could be mind-controlled by priests, and were luckily strong enough with a shield wall and a taunt to be able to tank the boss, making this fight possible, while leaving the actual tanks to just kind of set aside in case of an emergency and hold the non-mind controlled adds. So for this fight, the priests were technically the tanks, and in the remake for Wrath, they just added a device that lets you mind control the adds so you didn't have to bring one specific class. And at number 8, we have one of the most infamous dungeons, the Oculus, and its final boss, the Lay Guardian Aragos. This boss steps up the free-for-all of the Grand Champions, while at the same time allowing everyone a chance at tanking instead of only priests, like with Razuvious, while also letting anyone DPS, or heal too. Midway through the dungeon, you save 3 dragons, and they offer you assistance by giving you an item that allows you to summon a dragon mount. Each of these mounts has a different set of abilities, Amber for dealing damage, Emerald for healing, and then the Ruby for tank. All 3 of them had a separate amount of abilities that basically allowed them to specialize in DPS, healing, or tanking. With these, you would choose any dragon you wanted, allowing you to play any role you wanted. 3 tanks, 2 heals, 1 heals, 4 DPS, or whatever combo. There was even an achievement for killing the boss without one of the colors. To get the achievement, you had to do a run with no tanks, another with no healers, and another with no DPS. Although if you were good enough, you could double up and do it with no tanks and no DPS, for examples. Healers could DPS, tanks could heal, and DPS could tank. At number 7, we have the chess event from Karazhan, which is actually the first ever vehicle fight. There were fights like Razuvious and Razorgro before it, but both of those had you mind control a mob, which still left the player out in the open free to be attacked. The chess event was the first fight to have players actually become mounted in a vehicle, protecting them from attacks. Players would enter the room to find a massive chessboard with pieces that are replaced with alliance and horde characters and creatures. While there was no dedicated tank for this, all the mobs have different abilities, as there was the pawns who held the front line, the king, all the other pieces being good at soaking damage, especially the bishop's healers who were able to protect the king's HP pool, even more so important since the king dying would lose you or win you the fight. It was quite the unique fight, being also the first time players all needed to take control of a vehicle-like things, instead of 1 or 2 people doing so. And at number 6, we have the most famous vehicle fight, Flame Leviathan. This fight had you pitted against a Titanic tank, with your only hope for defeating it using siege weapons, with 3 different vehicles to choose from, with the first being the Demolisher, acting as a DPS by firing barrels of pyrite, motorcycles acting as support by gathering pyrite to refuel the Demolishers and slow enemies, and then you had the steam tanks. These slow but powerful tanks acted as sort of a tank for the Flame Leviathan fight, holding aggro on the boss in between its fixates, and holding on to its adds that came from activating the hard mode version of the fight. It had a couple of good abilities, a ram and AoE cleave that interrupted spellcasters, and a charge, as well as a shield that could be activated by the tank's gunner. The fight was amazing in its sense of scale and lack of the usual roles. Vehicle fights like Flame Leviathan are superb, but sadly there are very few fights like it because it wasn't that well liked, and is one of the reasons we no longer see vehicle fights anymore, nor will you see any more of them on this list. However, if you want a more in-depth coverage of vehicle fights, go check out our video on vehicle fights. Now onto the more normal fights in the higher spots on this list. And at number 5, first we have to explain something. While the normal tanking classes and specs were very good at tanking, there were sometimes fights in WoW's histories where tanks were worse at tanking a particular mechanic of a fight than a DPS player could be. And the first one of these we'll be covering is Leotheras the Blind from the Serpent Giant Cavern. Warlocks had many things that made them able to tank better than the usual tanks in very niche circumstances. First, they can gain and hold aggro at ranged easily thanks to their spammable Searing Pain ability, which generated extra threat for RP reasons, something that no other class could do, even tanks. They also had insane survivability, both in damage reduction and in healing, and able to build great levels of spell resistance, especially in fire and shadow. So how did this matter on Leotheras? Well, during his fight he would cast a whirlwind which dealt high damage to people in melee. So melee had to step back and wait a bit during a lot of portions of the fight. And once in a while he would enter his demon phase, which was the only time melee players could do legitimate damage to the boss for extended periods of time. And with an enraged timer, they really needed to do all the damage they could in this short window. But the boss had one more AoE, Chaos Bolt, and a blast of fire damage at launch of the tank that did a large AoE damage around them. So if using a conventional tank, the melee DPS would never get a chance to actually hit the boss. So using a Warlock tank with max fire resist to sit in the back and hold the boss's Chaos Bolt spam during this phase, which would allow melee to finally get in and burst the boss down without fear of being AoE to death. And at number 4, we have High King Mulgar, the first boss in Gruul's lair. This boss fight was an ogre council you need to kill, each member of the council being a class, and the one we'll be talking about today is Krosh Firehand, the mage. Because he is a mage, he would of course be countered by another mage. He had a few spells, an AoE, a single target burst, and his important ability being Spell Shield. This 30-second duration buff reduces magic damage taken by 75%. Now what mages could do was spell steal this buff, allowing them to then tank the boss. While the fireballs he would cast would one-shot some players and nearly one-shot tanks, the mage with 75% damage reduction could easily tank this spellslinger. He would recast the shield again right after the shield ran out, allowing the mage to have almost 100% uptime on the spell stolen shield, only hitting a bit of a hiccup if the shield ran out in the middle of him casting a fireball, as he couldn't reapply the shield while casting. But hey, if the fireball snuck in, a healer was ready to heal you back up, so you could spell steal the next shield. That is if it did not one-shot you first. And at number 3, we have the Blood Prince Council fight in Icecrown Citadel raid. This boss fight pitted you against 3 San'laein who all share the same health pool, literally. While one of them has a health pool, the other 2 have no health. Kel'Thuzeth did not do much damage most of the fight, however, once in a while during the fight he would be empowered. And once empowered, his shadow attacks would be enough to easily one-shot any player, tank or not. How you avoided this was by attacking a mob that would spawn in the fight called the Dark Nuclei. These mobs would attack whoever hit them last, not following the normal rules of aggro. They would attack by applying a stacking dot to whoever they hit. This dot did very little damage while also reducing the target's shadow damage taken. So groups would just use a Warlock to tank the boss. They would apply long-term dots like Curse of Agony onto these nuclei to constantly gain stacks, and these stacks of course keeping them safe from the boss's burst damage. It was difficult for other classes to do this as well, because lack of easy ranged dots, and also the natural shadow resistance that Warlocks had, meant it was pretty much always the Warlock's job. Although anyone could do it, they just couldn't do it as well as Warlocks. And at number 2, we have Illidan Stormrage upon Black Temple. Illidan has a lot of similarities with the earlier boss, Leotheras, like father, like son, I guess. Both demon hunters had a demon within phase that caused them to fire barrages of AoE spells at their tank. The difference being, while Leotheras did fire damage, Illidan dealt shadow damage. So the Warlock in full shadow resist setup would spam Searing Pain and dots until this phase transitioned, and while staying away from the group, they would start spamming self-heals, like Siphon Life, Drain Life, Healthstone, and Shadow Ward. Alongside a dedicated healer, they simply acted as a shadow damage dealing sponge, holding the boss while the rest of the raid dealt with constant spawning shadow demons. This phase was extremely important, especially since it was basically the end of the fight. Warlocks were amazing off-tanks. Their abilities gave them the capabilities to take large amounts of magic damage, and also to tank from long range. And a lot of Warlock players loved it, a new playstyle in a normally DPS-only class. And at number 1, we have the Twin Emperors from Encourage, the first ever fight to utilize a Warlock tank, let alone any tank from a non-tank class. This fight consisted of 2 bosses, Valkor and Valkanash. For simplicity's sake, we'll call them the melee and spellcaster boss. They had a few mechanics of note. First, they shared a health pool, but if they got too close to each other, they would heal quickly. So letting them get close to each other was basically a wipe. Second was they would teleport, swapping places every 30-ish seconds. Lastly, they were immune to the opposite's damage type, meaning the melee was immune to spells and the spellcaster was immune to physical damage. So now to the part of this fight that is important for this video. The spellcaster boss was immune to physical damage, and pairing that with a powerful AoE knockback that dealt heavy damage and slowed constantly meant that usual melee tanks couldn't even attempt to tank this boss. So instead you would send in a warlock tank. Max shadow resistance with a dedicated healer, the warlock tank was perfect for this boss, as his only real tank-focused damage ability was a shadow bolt, easily reduced by warlock's high shadow resist and paired with their shadow ward ability. The arcane burst ability was completely avoided by being a warlock, and while the boss had many other abilities it could cast, they were mostly just AoEs that people needed to move out of, like Blizzard. You usually needed 2 warlock tanks, 1 on each side, as well as 1 warrior per side, because of the before mentioned teleport, meaning once they teleported, they needed to be tanked there. You couldn't let them run back to their original tank or else they would heal. This fight was very complicated overall and very long, but it was the first time a warlock tank was made a reality. All of the fights listed are from Vanilla, TBC, and Wrath of the Lich King, and outside of the vehicle fights, off-tanking was usually a warlock thing. But there were a couple of instances where other classes could theoretically off-tank in some situations as well. Post-Cataclysm, these kinds of fights don't really happen very much anymore. Usually, if there's a special mechanic, they make it in a way so that a normal off-tank can just do the tanking without needing a DPS to do it. And with that, that's the end of the video. This video was a request on the Patreon. You too can go there to get videos early, recommend future topics, etc, etc.